Today we'll be discussing the Abramoff scandal from a records perspective. The scandal was actually comprised of several different scandals, some interrelated, some that stood on their own. To provide some background, Jack Abramoff and his associates were involved in a number of illicit activities that tested their ethical obligations and in many cases violated the law. Records and subsequent convictions indicate that many of those who are involved in this far-flung scandal were aware of their wrongdoing at the time that it occurred. The following assessment of the Abramoff scandal is based on the reporting by the Washington Post, Committee on Indian Affairs' final report on Gimme 5, and a 2007 lawsuit filed by Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, aka CREW, against the Department of Homeland Security. The following is only a partial summary of illegal activities Abramoff was linked to or indicted for. Corrupt lobbying. For several years, Jack Abramoff and others defrauded multiple Native American tribes whom they represented as lobbyists for purposes of promoting casinos on reservations. In the course of their lobbying efforts, Abramoff and company overbilled clients, failed to disclose conflicts of interest, and even worked against their clients' interests, later offering consulting services to counter the very opposition they secretly engineered against their own clients. This practice is known as double dealing. In one case, the Tigwa tribe fell victim to anti-casino lobbying efforts led by Abramoff, and their gambling operations were suspended. The Tigwa, unaware of Abramoff's anti-casino lobbying work, later retained Abramoff's firm to engage in lobbying efforts to reinstate gambling on the reservation. Overbilling. The overbilling that occurred with Abramoff's tribal clients was replicated with other clients in a scheme dubbed Gimme 5. Here, Abramoff, in the employ of Greenberg Traurig, referred clients to Michael Scanlon's public affairs consulting firm for vague services that were billed at exorbitant rates. Clients were unaware of the business relationship between Abramoff and Scanlon, and the two split the profits from the referrals. The origin of this plan was documented in emails between Scanlon and Abramoff. In some cases, Abramoff misappropriated funds from tribal clients for use in unrelated projects such as the construction of an Orthodox Jewish school in Maryland. Abramoff was able to gain insider access to politicians by hiring former staffers of those politicians, such as Congressman Bob Ney's former staffer Neil Volz. Again, clients were generally unaware of these relationships and conflicts of interest. Pay for play and bribery. Abramoff was accused and convicted in several cases of providing illegal gifts and donations to lawmakers in exchange for favors on behalf of his clients, also known as pay for play, in support of the legislation they were pushing. These gifts were illegal in that they circumvented House ethics rules that prevented lobbyists from accepting gifts from private parties. Abramoff skirted this rule by depositing the funds for gifts and trips to politicians, such as Tom DeLay, into think tanks and other nonprofits that he was affiliated with, and paying the politicians and their campaigns directly through those entities. Congressman Bob Ney, Conrad Burns, and John Doolittle were all found to have ties with Abramoff and received gifts in exchange for furthering Abramoff's lobbying efforts. Use of nonprofits to obscure lobbying activities. In addition to improper gifts to politicians, Abramoff and his associates operated several nonprofit organizations and think tanks that were used to route campaign donations and avoid taxes. Several of these think tanks, such as the American International Center, served no purpose other than to route political donations. Abramoff and Scanlon utilized several fictitious charitable organizations to facilitate illegal political donations as well as gifts. Falsification of documents. Prior to the Indian casino scandals, Abramoff and an associate purchased the Sun Cruise Casino cruise line. Abramoff and his business partner were later found guilty of forging a wire transfer that substantiated the availability of funds for the purchase. The incident was later linked to illegal political lobbying activities when Abramoff solicited assistance from Congressman Ney to support the purchase of Sun Cruise in the congressional record. Although the events detailed in the previous slide took place more than a decade ago, and many have since been prosecuted, some of the same loopholes that facilitated these illicit activities still remain. Subsequent analysis of the Abramoff scandals have led to recommendations and reforms. However, many issues remain to be addressed. The following is a list of recommendations that seek to address the lobbying, bribery, money laundering, and falsification of documents at issue in the Abramoff scandal. Several preventative measures could have been taken to mitigate the potential influence of federal employees and politicians by lobbyists. For instance, current email retention standards vary widely among the three branches of government, and especially at the time of the Abramoff scandal. Enforcement of such rules is spotty, and the National Archives and Records Administration doesn't always have the support it needs to make and enforce existing record-keeping laws. In 2008, Representative Waxman of California introduced legislation to tighten up the Presidential Records Act and the Federal Records Act with the introduction of H.R. 5811, the Electronic Communications Preservation Act. The bill sought to require federal agencies to archive emails and other electronic communications in electronic format, as opposed to the print, file, and save method that was then in use. The bill also would have required the National Archives to set minimum standards for archiving systems, conduct audits to ensure agency compliance, and certify that the Executive Office of the President was meeting those standards. The bill eventually passed the House with a veto-proof margin. Had this bill existed at the time of the Abramoff scandal, improper relationships between lobbyists and government officials may have been identified sooner or prevented altogether. A 2007 lawsuit by Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, known as CREW, against the Department of Homeland Security revealed flaws in the processing of Freedom of Information Act requests as well as adherence to the Federal Records Act. CREW sued the Department of Homeland Security for records pertaining to visits by Abramoff and his associates to the White House and Vice President's residence. The Department of Homeland Security was unable to comply in a timely fashion due to the fact that the Secret Service had erased such records per DHS policy. The spoliation aspect of the suit might have been addressed by the previous recommendations of the Electronic Communications Preservation Act, as well as those of the Federal Records Act. However, the case was eventually dismissed because CREW lacked standing to request such relief. Although the case was dismissed, it highlighted flaws in Freedom of Information Act requests, specifically the time frame in which requests must be responded to. The case also highlighted the seemingly arbitrary application of federal record-keeping laws. Heightened enforcement of both processes is required to ensure government transparency. Authenticity of documents. As discussed in the summary, Abramoff and his colleague were able to proceed with the purchase of Sun Cruise casinos without any down payment using a falsified wire transfer statement as proof of funds. Today, much of the discussion concerning the reliability of documents, physical or electronic, revolves around the ability to authenticate the document for what it purports to be. In this case, the entire situation could have been prevented with a stronger authentication process, such as requesting the proof of wire transfer directly from the issuing institution. Further, physical records could have been substituted for electronic records, which might have included an email trail, creating further links between the issuer and the receiving party. Additionally, metadata contained in electronic records can also be used to ensure a document's reliability. The latter point is broadly applicable not only to the Sun Cruise incident, but to most of the electronic records at issue throughout the Abramoff scandal, regardless of whether the records originated on a private or public server. Disclosures and cooperation between agencies. Despite the fact that there are laws in place that govern the disclosure of lobbying activities, movement of lobbyists between lobbying firms and political offices, conflicts of interest, and gifts to politicians, there is no centralized repository for such disclosures. The potential benefit and transparency of such disclosures is blunted by lack of cooperation between agencies or a centralized repository. Such disclosures are only partially effective if partially disseminated. Unfortunately, privacy and interoperability issues have long stood in the way of effective interagency cooperation. One possible solution would be to legislate a role for NARA to receive and centrally store such records for select access by a variety of government agencies. Let's discuss a few key takeaways. First, rules and ethics are different but may influence one another, and both must be taken into account when considering a records policy, but also your behavior in any career that you may be involved with. Secondly, we must learn from our mistakes, and that may take the form of applying those learnings to new plans going forward, or to reflect on those mistakes so that they aren't repeated. Additionally, we should find and close loopholes in the law that allow such mistakes and wrongdoing to continually occur. And finally, we should share information whenever possible. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please view the links provided here. Thank you for listening.